Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do a video that was slightly inspired, well, very inspired, by Grace over at GK Reads. About a month or so ago, she did her 1K Q&A video, in which somebody asked the question, if you had to pick 3 books to help someone understand you, what would they be? And I really love this idea of picking out 3 books that basically encapsulate your entire reading taste, or your personality. They don't have to all be 3 of your favourite books of all time, but 3 books that go a really long way in kind of explaining your reading taste, and the kinds of topics and themes that you're into. And I thought it would be a fun little challenge to kind of think of what would be my 3 books. And I'd love to hear from you which 3 books would really work for you for this question. And thank you to Grace for the inspiration for this video. So the first book that immediately sprung to mind for me was The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. The story of young Liesel Memminger, who is growing up in World War II Nazi Germany. When her mother is taken away and arrested as a communist, she is adopted by the Huberman family. She initially is illiterate and she cannot read, but she is fascinated by books. But through the course of the book, she learns to read through the help of her adoptive father Hans. They really form a close bond, but also, as the title suggests, through the course of the book she starts stealing books, particularly books that were banned and burnt during the Nazi book burnings. I feel like this book goes a long way in explaining me as a reader, but also particularly my reading taste and my interests, especially historically, from when I was a lot younger. This is very much linked to my pre-uni self. When I was in high school, I was really fascinated by World War II and the Nazi regime and what it was like to live under the Nazis. So this book really appealed to me in that regard, because this is set in a German town. We are not looking at the higher ups at all, we are looking at the ordinary German citizens and how they led their daily lives living under this regime. Maybe sounds a bit weird to say, but I also have always had a bit of a passing fascination with death, and particularly the personification of death. And I feel like that's something that people don't really know about me, so when somebody initially recommended this book to me, they were kind of like, oh, just so you know, the narrator is death, if that's weird for you. And I was like, no, that sounds amazing, I want that right now. That was just like an extra tick for me. And something that has stayed with me since I started getting back into reading is that I love books which discuss the importance of books, how literature can really change somebody's life and their worldview, and how important it is to be able to read whatever you want. That's an interest I've probably had since I got back into reading at age 18, and it's one that has continued ever since. The second book that I'm going to mention is, of course, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I mean, it would have felt weird if I didn't include this. I'm a massive fan of Jane Austen, as I've mentioned before, and I'm a massive fan of classics. I always feel like I don't read enough classics, but definitely when I think back on the books that I've enjoyed the most, I love reading writing from the time periods that I like to study. Often a lot more than I do enjoy historical fiction that is set in that particular time period. But as well as my interest in classics, I think this book also kind of demonstrates my interest in character and relationship focused stories. In Pride and Prejudice, you've got the Bennet family, and every single one of those sisters are very well defined in terms of their personalities. The different families around them, all of their different neighbours are very strongly defined, to the extent that there are multiple different Pride and Prejudice retellings from those different characters. Even the antagonists in these stories are really compelling and really interesting, and you kind of delight in seeing them be awful on the page. And that definitely appeals to me with other books. And also Pride and Prejudice really appeals to my love of a romance plot. It's interesting considering that I actually don't read very much that is like purely romance genre, and maybe there's a bit of like residual like academic snobbery that I've inherited from other people who are always like, oh, romance, oh, don't like that in a book. And I'm always just kind of like, oh, people don't like romance plots? Really? I think maybe that's because I'm a child who has been brought up on a very steady diet of like Disney and rom-coms, but I love a good romance. Definitely something I think I should work on more in 2021 is reading more like pure romance books. Or maybe romantic comedies. Oh, where my interests lie. This also has a bit of a romance trope that I love, which is enemies to lovers, which is always really funny to me because I feel like I would hate that in real life. I am not a fan of confrontation. I do not like bickering. No, I don't have the energy for that. But in books, oh, sold. Gobble it up. Something that I think a lot of people often criticise Pride and Prejudice, and just Jane Austen in general, for is that the plots are often quite slow. Her plots are very much like slow-paced, social commentary laden, very character focused, very much like social dynamics focused. And that doesn't appeal to a lot of people, especially if you are more into your action, but so appeals to me. I love her books because often I feel like people get out of them feeling like nothing happened in a particular chapter, but it's like everything happened in that chapter. Each scene is kind of like a microcosm for what is going on in society at large, and I love that so much. It's very witty, it's very subtle and snarky, which I love. And then the final book to understand me is The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, which is the final installment in the Thomas Cromwell trilogy. Have you had enough of me mentioning this book yet? But yes, I put this in this slot because if you need to know anything about me, it's that I love history, and I especially love the Tudors. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I have a bit of a thing for royalty, and I blame Disney entirely for that. But I find royalty, I find monarchy so incredibly fascinating to learn about and to see narratives from that point of view. This also particularly ties into a lot of my non-fiction reading as well. But like I say, I love character and relationships focused fiction, but especially I love reading biographies. I love reading history that is very character focused rather than event focused. I think this also ties well with my fiction reading because I like my historical fiction to be very well researched, but for everything to kind of be very tied together. Themes that are very clear and everything kind of links into the next thing. As with the other books that I've mentioned, this is much more slower paced, it is very reflective. And I like that. I like a little bit of like pausing the plot for a little bit to reflect on life. This also links in very well to something that Melina from Melina Reads pointed out in my ranking of historical fiction books I'd read in 2020, which is that I tend to prefer my historical fiction to be focused around characters that already exist, whether or not they already exist in history or already exist in like a previous fiction book. I do tend to get a lot more enjoyment when I already know the characters, and it's just that particular author putting their own spin on these people that we already know. And Hilary Mantel definitely has her own interpretation of Thomas Cromwell that has really influenced what other people think of him now, and I think that's so brilliant. Something that I've recently learned about myself, I think I've talked about in a previous video or a video that's coming out soon, is that I'm very much like a concept focused reader. For me, it's often not good enough to be told, oh, this is in a genre that I particularly like, or it's an author that I've liked the work of previously. If the idea of the book, if the concept behind the book doesn't kind of like spring out to me and grab me, then it's probably not going to do much for me when I actually read it. But if you say to me something like, this is the Tudor court but told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, making him the hero of the story whereas he'd previously been seen as the villain, I'm going to be like, oh, interesting. I want to see what I think of that. You'll see that in other books that I've read recently, so things like The Other Bennet Sisters, so it's Pride and Prejudice but told from the perspective of Mary Bennet. Okay, sold. The story of William Shakespeare's family told from their perspective rather than William Shakespeare's. Interesting. Or something like The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary, this idea of two people who share like one bed and they never meet because they've got differing work schedules. Interesting. I want to read that. So those are my 3 books today. Hopefully they have given you a little bit more insight into the kinds of things that I like. I'd love to hear any recommendations you've got for me based on the kind of things I've said in this video. And I'd love to hear about your 3 books. What are 3 books that would really encapsulate your reading and explain you? I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.